Let's get right into it. Today, in this explainer, we are decoding a really fascinating concept from Vernon Heckler's work, Living Downstream. But we're looking at this through a highly specific lens today. Listen, we're not going to sit here and talk about personal failure or some arbitrary lack of willpower or feeling guilty about your bad habits. Nope. Instead, we are going to scientifically deconstruct this idea of living downstream as a highly predictable mechanical behavioral drift system. We're going to map out exactly how you might be losing your agency through repeated reactive loops, and far more importantly, how to mechanically reclaim it.
Here is our roadmap for the breakdown. 1. The mechanics of drift. 2. Structural causes of erosion. 3. Agency and feedback loops. 4. Upstream intervention points. And 5. Designing aligned ecosystems. Starting right off with Section 1, the mechanics of drift. Understanding the default system.
So what is behavioral drift? It is absolutely not an emotional slump. It's a systemic state. It's built entirely on passive, reactive loops that are driven by the human mind's totally natural optimization for comfort. You know, like when your brain convinces you that a quick 5-minute social media break is exactly what you need to be productive. Right? The source material really emphasizes that downstream living is incredibly quiet. It doesn't announce itself with loud alarms. It just quietly siphons your self-direction away because, well, it feels like normalcy. You wake up, you scroll your feeds, answer messages, and just kind of follow the path of least resistance. It's an automated system prioritizing immediate comfort over your long-term agency.
Every single choice we make essentially places us into one of two systems. The downstream system is basically an inner tube ride. It's built on reactive loops, passive friction, and it is entirely comfort optimized. Now, the alternative isn't just trying harder or magically summoning superhuman strength out of nowhere. The alternative is the upstream system, and that requires intentional architecture, active flow, and being design optimized. This is our core decision framework today. If you don't intentionally design that upstream architecture, your brain is going to automatically default right back to the downstream inner tube. For sure.
To stop that default process, you have to recognize it first. Heckler actually puts it perfectly. The erosion we cannot yet see is often the most dangerous. Awareness is the first anchor even before action. Think about it. You don't stop a rushing river by violently throwing your body into it. No way. The very first mechanical intervention is simply inserting a pause for observation. Like placing a measuring pole in moving water, you just need to feel the pull and understand its direction before you can build any sort of structural architecture against it. Which brings us to Section 2, structural causes of erosion, how the downstream system maintains itself. Okay, so we know the system defaults to comfort, but how on earth does it sustain that drift without you just throwing your hands up and rebelling? It does it through invisible erosion. The system literally disguises the loss of your agency as daily normalcy and convenience. It whispers that answering those endless notifications immediately is just being responsible or being a good team player. We are brilliant at lying to ourselves about this, aren't we? It's highly effective precisely because there is no overt force. It just slowly flattens your vitality and narrows your potential entirely under the radar. So what actually maintains this erosion mechanically? It acts exactly like sediment, subtly reshaping a riverbed over a long period of time. Think of these like falling dominoes. First up, you have environmental reinforcement. Think of all that constant digital noise and social expectation poking at you all day. Then comes habituation to the path of least resistance. You just get used to taking the easy way out. Next is the mind's rationalization. Your brain will literally invent logic to justify staying in familiar patterns because it strictly equates comfort with safety. And finally, the accumulation of small, passive compromises. None of these things destroy your agency overnight, but they mechanically erode it layer by microscopic layer. Let's move on to Section 3, agency and feedback loops, the mechanics of energy, attention, and will. Here is where we really shift to the internal mechanics of the whole thing. Energy, attention, and will form loops. Heckler uses this to completely dismantle the idea that willpower is just some brute force muscle that you have to flex harder. It's absolutely not. Dispelling that myth is huge. Willpower is actually a flow, and it is heavily, heavily dependent on systemic feedback loops. So let's take a look at how these loops actually function in practice. Here's how this builds a negative downstream loop. Step 1 is scattered attention. You react to an external stimulus. An email pings, a Slack message pops up, your phone buzzes. This lack of a clear channel causes Step 2, energy drain.
It creates an invisible cognitive fatigue because your energy is dispersing, kind of like water spilled across a dry sponge. There's no focus to it. And that leads directly to step 3, willpower damned. You've created friction, your motivation naturally falters, and you fall right into passivity. Every single time you go through this loop, you deepen your downstream habits. Now contrast that with a positive upstream loop. Step 1 is focused attention. You structurally narrow your focus into clear channels. Because the channel is clear, step 2 is energy amplification. Literally just one deliberate, uninterrupted hour on meaningful work produces massive compounding momentum, which yields step 3, will as flow. Take a moment to really absorb this. When your energy and attention are mechanically aligned, action becomes sustainable and nearly frictionless. You aren't forcing the water at all, you've just engineered a much better riverbed. So how do we actually engineer that? That's section 4, upstream intervention points, disrupting the reactive flow. The source material is completely adamant about this. You do not need to fight the current violently. You only need to engineer structural interventions. Small, deliberate nudges are incredibly effective mechanical disruptions to a downstream drift. Think of it like placing small stones in a river. You disrupt the current, you create a ripple, and you slightly shift the force of the water. Over time, those little stones effortlessly reshape the flow entirely. This is a real game changer because it completely removes guilt from the equation. Let's make this practical and map it out as a decision matrix. How do we structurally reroute our days from reactive drift to intentional flow? Take an everyday trigger like a digital notification. The downstream drift is mindless scrolling and scattered attention, but the upstream intervention, scheduled deep work blocks. You are structurally removing the trigger from your environment entirely. Or take midday fatigue. Instead of the downstream response of passive media consumption, you swap in an intentional micro-recovery ritual, maybe a 5-minute walk outside without your phone. What about a complex task? The default downstream response is avoidance through rationalization. The upstream intervention is just a 15-minute minimal micro-habit to bypass that initial friction. You are simply mechanically swapping out the default response. To build these interventions, Heckler identifies 3 brilliant architectural tools. First, minimalist pruning. This is the strategic elimination of non-essential friction, doing less but doing it with far more intention. Second, microhabits. These aren't about relying on fleeting rah-rah motivation. They are the literal bricks you lay daily to build an upstream canal. And third, selective constraints. This means using limits on your time or resources not to restrict yourself, but to intentionally channel your creative force and focus your attention. This is the exact structural scaffolding required to sustain your energy. Finally, let's look at section 5, designing aligned ecosystems, scaling upstream systems to the network level. Individual interventions are powerful, absolutely, but true mastery scales. It embeds upstream behavior into shared ecosystems so that alignment persists autonomously. Whether you are a team leader, a parent, or just a colleague, sustainable leadership isn't about micromanaging or forcing people to just work harder. It involves designing environments, systems, and cultures that automatically guide an entire network of individuals upstream, radically reducing the friction for everyone involved. A resilient upstream ecosystem relies on 4 interconnected components. It breaks down like this. You have shared routines making up about 30%. These are the standardized ways a team or family operates to protect focus and energy. Aligned principles make up 25%, ensuring everyone actually understands the why behind the flow. Structural scaffolding is another 25%, representing the physical or digital environments that reduce noise. And finally, mentorship networks at 20%, where these habits are actively passed down. Together, these elements form a massive, powerful levee that protects the whole group against downstream forces. As Heckler brilliantly notes, a single current can nourish 1,000 streams. Map your flow, observe the ripples, and let your upstream influence multiply. When you engineer an upstream system for yourself, you inevitably model it for others. That single point of structural alignment acts as a massive force multiplier, cascading through all your professional and personal networks. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. I want you to look at your own daily loops, your energy, and your attention. Really ask yourself, are you actively designing the architecture of your environment, or are you just drifting downstream in someone else's system? The water is moving either way. It's time to decide exactly where you want to place your first stone.